I stepped off the elevator onto the 23rd floor of the Carter and Hayes building in Atlanta, the familiar hum of ambition vibrating through the air. The glass walls gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting the city skyline like a trophy case of power. 10 years abroad, Paris, mostly, had sharpened my edges, but standing here again, I felt the old hunger gnawing at me. The kind that doesn't let you sleep. The kind that whispers your name in the dark and dares you to take what's yours. The office smelled of polished wood and fresh ink, a scent that carried me back to my early days here, scrambling as a junior associate. Now, at 42, I was returning as a senior litigator, a title I'd earned through sleepless nights and victories carved out of chaos. My suit, tailored in the marais, clung to me like a second skin, a quiet armor against the stares I felt tracking me across the open floor. The younger associates darted glances my way, some curious, others wary. I didn't care. I wasn't here to make friends. The conference room loomed ahead, its frosted glass doors a barrier between me and the first real test of this homecoming. I adjusted my tie, a deep burgundy that matched the fire I'd nursed all those years away, and pushed through. The air inside was thick, heavy with the weight of egos and unspoken stakes. A long mahogany table stretched before me, flanked by leather chairs, each one occupied by a face I'd either forgotten or never known. Except one. Nathan Brooks sat at the head, his posture all sharp angles and smug assurance. Department head now, I'd heard. His hair was still jet black, slicked back like he'd spent an extra 10 minutes in the mirror to remind everyone who he was. He didn't stand when I entered, just leaned back, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. I remembered that smirk. It was the same one he'd flashed a decade ago when he'd taken credit for my work on the Erickson case, the one that got him his first promotion. James Carter, he drawled, letting my name hang in the air like a punchline. Back from the land of croissants and berets, huh? Didn't think you'd show your face around here again. What are you, pushing 50 now? The room shifted, a ripple of stifled laughter from the others. I felt my jaw tighten, the heat rising in my chest. I wasn't 50, not even close, but Nathan knew how to find a nerve and press. Hard. I forced a smile, thin and sharp, and dropped my briefcase onto the table with a deliberate thud. 42, Nathan. Young enough to keep up, old enough to know better. How's the view from the top treating you? His smirk faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. I'd landed a jab, and the tension in the room thickened. He straightened, his eyes narrowing as he sized me up. Top's fine. Just don't expect a warm welcome, Carter. Things have changed since you ran off to play expat. We don't carry deadweight here. The word stung, but I didn't flinch. I'd faced worse, hostile judges, cutthroat opposing counsel, clients who'd sell their souls for a plea deal. Nathan was a bully with a title, nothing more. Still, the barb hooked into something deeper, a flicker of doubt I hadn't expected. Had I been gone too long? Was I stepping into a game I no longer knew how to play? Before I could fire back, the door swung open again, and a woman slipped in, her arms loaded with files. She was young, mid-20s, maybe, with dark hair pulled into a tight bun and shadows under her eyes that spoke of too many late nights. Emily Harper, I'd learn later, though at that moment she was just a blur of nervous energy. She set the stack down with a soft thud, her hands trembling slightly as she avoided Nathan's gaze. Harper, you're late, Nathan snapped, his voice a whip crack that made her flinch. What's the point of you if you can't keep up? She murmured an apology, her voice so quiet it barely reached me, and I felt a pang of something, sympathy, maybe, or recognition. I'd been her once, bowing under the weight of someone else's arrogance. Nathan didn't even look at her as she retreated to a corner chair, but I did. There was a spark in her, buried under the exhaustion, and I wondered how long it had been since anyone noticed. The meeting dragged on, a parade of updates and posturing, but my mind kept circling back to Nathan. His casual cruelty, the way he wielded his position like a club, it lit a fuse in me I hadn't felt in years. I'd come back to Atlanta to reclaim what I'd left behind, to prove I still belonged in this world of power and prestige. But watching him, I realized it wasn't just about climbing the ladder anymore. It was personal. He'd built his throne on the backs of people like me, like Emily, and I wanted to see it crack. By the time the room emptied out, my hands were clenched at my sides, the old fire roaring louder than ever. I lingered, staring out the window at the sprawling city below, its lights pulsing like a heartbeat. This was my arena now, and Nathan Brooks had just made himself the first target. I didn't know how yet, but I'd find a way to unravel him, thread by thread if I had to. The next morning, I found myself back in the belly of Carter and Hayes, the hum of the office a constant undercurrent to my thoughts. The city outside pressed against the windows, gray and restless, mirroring the churn in my gut. I'd barely slept, Nathan's words looping through my mind like a taunt I couldn't shake. Dead weight. The phrase clawed at me, stirring up a restlessness I hadn't felt since my first years here, when every case felt like a fight for survival. I'd come back to prove something, to myself, to them, but now I wondered if I'd misjudged the battlefield. The open floor buzzed with activity, associates darting between desks, their voices a low murmur of deadlines and deals. I settled at my station, a sleek corner desk with a view of the conference room where Nathan had laid his trap yesterday. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but my eyes kept drifting to that frosted glass, replaying his smirk, the way he'd leaned back as if he owned the air itself. The room beyond was empty now, its silence a stark contrast to the tension still coiled inside me. That's when I noticed her again, Emily Harper. She was tucked at a desk near the back, half hidden by a stack of files that looked ready to topple. Her shoulders were hunched, her face pale under the harsh lights, and she moved with the jittery precision of someone running on fumes. I watched as she scribbled notes, then paused, rubbing her eyes with a hand that shook just enough to betray her. She hadn't said much in the meeting, but Nathan's snap at her had stuck with me. There was something about her, fragile, yes, but fighting to hold it together. I knew that look. I'd worn it once. Before I could think it through, I was on my feet, crossing the floor with my coffee mug in hand as a flimsy excuse. Up close, the strain on her was even clearer, dark circles carved under her eyes, a faint tremor in her fingers as she flipped through pages. She didn't notice me until I stopped beside her, and when she did, she flinched, her pen clattering to the desk. "Sorry," I said, keeping my voice low, "easy. Didn't mean to sneak up on you. You look like you could use a break." Her eyes flicked up to mine, wide and wary, then softened just a fraction. "Oh, Mr. Carter, right? I'm fine, really. Just a lot to get through." Her voice was thin, threaded with exhaustion, but there was a spark of gratitude in it, like she wasn't used to anyone noticing. "James," I corrected, setting my mug down on the edge of her desk. "And I've seen fine before. You're drowning back here. What's Nathan got you buried under?" She hesitated, glancing toward the conference room as if he might materialize from the shadows. "It's the Duval case," she admitted finally, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Depositions, research, client notes, he wants it all prepped by tomorrow, and I'm still cross-referencing last quarter's filings. I don't even know where to start." I leaned in, scanning the chaos of papers spread before her. Legal pads scrawled with notes, highlighted transcripts, a laptop glowing with a dozen open tabs. It was a mess, but a familiar one. I'd cut my teeth on workloads like this, back when I was too green to push back. "Tomorrow? That's insane. He's setting you up to fail." Her lips pressed into a tight line, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But then she nodded, a small, defeated gesture. "He does that. If it's not perfect, it's on me. And if it is, he takes the credit. I can't mess this up." The frustration in her voice hit me like a punch. I knew that trap, the way Nathan wielded power not just to climb but to crush. I'd felt it myself a decade ago, and seeing it now, played out on her, lit something fierce in me. "You won't," I said, sharper than I meant to. "Let me help. I've got time, and I've handled worse than this." Her head snapped up, surprise flickering across her face. "You don't have to, you just got back. I'm sure you've got your own, I've got this," I cut in, pulling a chair over before she could protest further. "Besides, I'd rather dig into something real than sit through another round of Nathan's chest thumping. Show me what you've got." She blinked, then gave a hesitant nod, sliding a stack of depositions my way. As we started sorting through the mess, the quiet meeting room behind us felt like a refuge, its walls buffering the chaos of the floor. The air was cooler there, tinged with the faint scent of whiteboard markers and leather. I walked her through the Duval file, breaking it down step by step, my French coming in handy when we hit a batch of untranslated correspondence. Her tension eased a little, her questions growing sharper, more confident. She was smart, I realized, sharper than Nathan probably gave her credit for. But then it happened, the spark that turned the simmer into a blaze. We were deep into a timeline of client meetings when the conference room door banged open, and Nathan stormed in, his face a mask of irritation. "Harper, where the hell's the Duval summary? I told you I needed it an hour ago." Emily froze, her hands clutching a pen like a lifeline. I'm still working on it, sir." "It's almost doesn't cut it," he snapped, his voice loud enough to turn heads beyond the glass. Then his eyes landed on me, and that smirk crept back, slow and venomous. "Carter. What's this, babysitting duty? Didn't think you'd stoop to playing tutor. Guess those French lessons didn't teach you how to stay in your lane." The room shrank, the air thickening with his arrogance. I felt my pulse kick up, a hot rush of anger I hadn't let loose in years. I stood, slow and deliberate, meeting his gaze head on. "Funny, Nathan. I'd say I'm exactly where I need to be. Helping someone you've buried under your ego. Maybe if you spent less time barking and more time working, she wouldn't need the assist. His smirk vanished, replaced by a hard glint in his eyes. The silence stretched, taut and electric, and I could feel Emily holding her breath beside me. Nathan took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. You think you can waltz back in here and call the shots? You're a relic, Carter. 10 years out there didn't make you a hero, it made you soft. Watch yourself. He turned on his heel and stalked out, leaving the door rattling in his wake. I exhaled, my hands flexing at my sides, the adrenaline still buzzing. Beside me, Emily let out a shaky breath, her voice barely a whisper. Thank you. You didn't have to do that. I glanced at her, saw the mix of relief and fear in her eyes, and felt the weight of what I'd just done settle in. I hadn't just helped her, I'd drawn a line. Nathan wasn't just a nuisance now, he was a threat, and I'd made myself his target. The old fire roared louder, but beneath it, a flicker of doubt crept in. Had I pushed too far, too fast? Or was this exactly the fight I'd come back for? The city outside pulsed on, oblivious, but in that quiet room, I knew something had shifted. This wasn't just about proving myself anymore. It was about tearing down the throne Nathan had built, and I'd just fired the first shot. The rest of that day clung to me like damp air, heavy and inescapable. The office hummed around me, a hive of clicking keyboards and hushed voices, but my mind was still trapped in that conference room, Nathan's growl, the way his eyes had bored into mine, daring me to push harder. I'd wanted to. God, I'd wanted to shove every smug word back down his throat. But as I sat at my desk now, the adrenaline fading into a dull ache, I felt the first tremor of something else, uncertainty. Had I just painted a target on my back, or was this the opening I'd been waiting for? The city skyline stretched out beyond the glass, its jagged edges softened by a late afternoon haze. From up here, Atlanta looked invincible, a fortress of steel and ambition. But I knew better. Down there, in the shadows of those towers, power wasn't just built, it was fought for, tooth and nail. And inside these walls, it was no different. I'd come back expecting a battlefield, but Nathan had turned it personal faster than I'd anticipated. That smirk of his, it wasn't just mockery. It was a warning. I rubbed my temples, trying to shake the tension coiling tighter with every passing minute. My desk was a mess already, notes from the Duval case scattered like shrapnel, a half-empty coffee cup leaving a faint ring on the wood. I should have been prepping for tomorrow's briefing, but my focus kept drifting to Emily. She'd gone back to her corner after Nathan's exit, her head bowed over those files like nothing had happened. But I'd seen the tremor in her hands, the way she'd flinched when he'd stormed out. She was tougher than she looked, I'd give her that, but she was cracking under the weight Nathan piled on her. And I'd just stepped into the middle of it. The clock on my screen ticked past 5, and the floor started to thin out, associates grabbing coats, muttering about drinks or deadlines. I stayed put, the quiet settling over me like a shroud. That's when I heard it, a soft clatter from the back of the room, followed by a muffled curse. I glanced over and saw Emily, her chair pushed back, one hand braced against her desk as she clutched a stack of papers to her chest. Her face was pale, too pale, and her breathing came in shallow bursts. I was on my feet before I could think it through, crossing the floor in long strides. Emily, you okay? My voice sounded sharper than I meant it to, cutting through the stillness. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide and glassy. I'm fine, just dropped something. But the words slurred at the edges, and as she straightened, her knees buckled. The file slipped from her grip, fanning across the floor, and she swayed hard. I lunged forward, catching her arm just before she hit the ground. Jesus, sit down, I said, easing her back into the chair. Her skin was clammy under my hand, her pulse racing where my fingers pressed against her wrist. You're not fine. When's the last time you ate? Slept? She shook her head, a weak protest forming on her lips, but it died as she slumped forward, her forehead resting on her arms. I don't know, last night, maybe? I had to finish the Duval prep, and Nathan, he said the client meeting tomorrow's make or break. I couldn't stop. I cursed under my breath, glancing at the chaos of her desk. She'd been running herself into the ground for him, and he'd probably planned it that way, keep her buried, keep her desperate. It was a power play, pure and simple, and it made my blood boil. Stay there, I told her, grabbing a water bottle from my desk and shoving it into her hands. Drink. Now. She obeyed, her movements slow and shaky, and I crouched beside her, gathering the scattered papers into a rough pile. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the faint hum of the HVAC system overhead. Up close, the strain on her was stark, her cheeks hollowed out, her eyes rimmed with red. She wasn't just tired, she was breaking. You can't keep this up, I said finally, keeping my voice low. He's grinding you down on purpose. You know that, right? Her fingers tightened around the bottle, and she nodded, just once. I know. But what am I supposed to do? He's the department head. If I push back, I'm out. I've seen it happen. The resignation in her voice hit me harder than I expected. I'd been there, trapped under someone else's boot, swallowing the anger because survival demanded it. But I wasn't that kid anymore, and I wasn't about to let Nathan turn her into one. You don't have to push back alone, I said, meeting her gaze. I'm here. We'll figure this out. She blinked, a flicker of something, hope, maybe, crossing her face. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. I leaned back, exhaling through my nose. Why was I doing this? Part of it was Nathan, his arrogance, the way he dismissed me like I was nothing. But it was more than that. Looking at Emily, I saw a piece of myself I'd buried years ago, back when I'd let people like him walk over me. I wanted to fight for her because no one had fought for me. Because I've been where you are, I said simply. And because he doesn't get to win. Before she could respond, the elevator dinged, and a shadow moved across the floor. Nathan. He strolled in, his coat slung over one arm, his eyes locking onto us like a predator sighting prey. Well, isn't this cozy, he said, his voice dripping with venom. Carter, you're still here? Thought you'd be halfway to a retirement home by now. I stood, slow and deliberate, planting myself between him and Emily. Just helping out a colleague. Something you wouldn't understand. His smirk returned, sharper this time. Helping, huh? Looks more like you're fishing for scraps. Careful, Carter, get too close to the bottom feeders, and you might not climb back up. The air crackled, every muscle in me tensing to strike. But before I could fire back, Emily's chair scraped behind me, and I heard a soft thud. I turned just in time to see her slump forward again, her head hitting the desk with a sickening crack. Panic surged through me as I dropped to her side, Nathan's laughter ringing in my ears. Guess she couldn't handle the pressure, he called, already heading for the elevator. Better clean that up, Carter. Big meeting tomorrow, wouldn't want to disappoint. The doors slid shut behind him, and I was left kneeling beside Emily, her breathing shallow but steady. I pressed a hand to her shoulder, my mind racing. She needed a doctor, but more than that, she needed someone to fight this war she couldn't wage alone. Nathan had pushed her to this, and now he'd handed me the perfect ammunition, if I could use it. The client meeting loomed like a storm cloud, and as I dialed for help, the pieces started falling into place. Tomorrow wasn't just about Duval anymore. It was about Nathan, about Emily, about every line he'd crossed. I'd walked back into this firm wanting to reclaim my place, but now I saw it clearer. I wasn't just here to climb. I was here to tear him down. The office lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the floor, and I felt the old fire flare hotter than ever. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The ambulance lights flickered through the windows of Carter and Hayes, slicing the dim office with streaks of red and blue. I stood there, hands shoved deep in my pockets, watching the paramedics wheel Emily out on a stretcher. Her eyes were half open, dazed but alive, and a knot of relief loosened in my chest. She'd be okay, physically, at least. The medics had muttered something about dehydration and exhaustion, but I knew the real culprit wasn't just a skipped meal or a late night. It was Nathan Brooks, his shadow stretching over her like a noose. As the elevator doors swallowed her up, I felt the air shift, heavy with the weight of what came next. Tomorrow wasn't just another day anymore, it was a reckoning. The office was a ghost town now, the hum of the city outside muffled by thick glass. I sank into Emily's chair, the cheap vinyl creaking under me, and stared at the wreckage she'd left behind. Papers sprawled across the desk, a battlefield of ink and desperation, client notes, deposition transcripts, a scribbled timeline for the Duval case that was due in hours. My fingers brushed the edge of a page, the paper still warm from her grip, and I felt a surge of something raw, something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Anger, sure, but beneath it, a hunger. Not just to win, but to break something. To break him. The client meeting loomed over me, its stakes sharper now than ever. Duval wasn't just a paycheck, it was a power play, a chance to shove Nathan's arrogance back in his face. He'd been riding high on that case, strutting around like it was his ticket to the top, but I'd seen the cracks. His French was rusty at best, he'd botched a translation in last month's prep call, and I'd caught it even through the haze of my jet lag. Tomorrow, with the client flying in from Paris, he'd be out of his depth. And I'd be ready. I leaned back, the chair groaning, and let my eyes drift to the corner office down the hall. Nathan's domain. The blinds were half-drawn, but I could picture him there earlier, barking orders, his voice cutting through the walls like a blade. That room wasn't just an office, it was a throne, built on years of stepping on necks like Emily's, like mine once. The mahogany desk, the leather chair, the view of Atlanta sprawling out like a kingdom, it screamed power, the kind I'd craved when I first walked these halls. Back then, I'd have killed for a seat like that. Now, I wanted to burn it down. The memory of his laugh as Emily hit the desk clawed at me, a sound so cold it made my skin tighten. He'd walked away like it was nothing, like she was nothing. My fists clenched, nails digging into my palms, and I felt the old fire flare hotter, edged with something darker. Revenge. It wasn't a word I'd let myself linger on before, justice, maybe, or payback, but now it fit. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he'd done, to choke on it. But there was a catch, a snag in the heat of it all. How far was I willing to go? The line between right and wrong blurred in this place, and I could feel it pulling at me, tempting me to cross it. I exhaled, slow and jagged, and forced myself to focus. The Duval file stared back at me, a lifeline in the chaos. I flipped it open, my eyes scanning the notes Emily had painstakingly pieced together. Her handwriting was tight, precise, every detail laid out like a map, except where Nathan had scrawled his own demands in red ink, slashing through her work like a conqueror marking territory. My jaw tightened. He didn't deserve this case. He didn't deserve her effort. But I could turn it against him. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, its rhythm steady against the storm in my head. I pulled my laptop closer, the glow of the screen cutting through the dark, and started digging. The client, Monsieur Lefebvre, was old school, sharp, meticulous, and fiercely proud of his Parisian roots. I'd dealt with men like him before, the kind who'd sniff out weakness in a heartbeat. Nathan thought he could coast on charm and a few butchered phrases, but I knew better. I'd spent a decade in France, arguing cases in smoky cafes and marble courtrooms. My French wasn't just fluent, it was a weapon. And tomorrow, I'd wield it. The plan took shape as the hours bled away, each keystroke a brick in the wall I was building. I'd let Nathan walk into that meeting blind, let him stumble over his own ego. Then I'd step in, calm, precise, fluent, and take it from him. Not just the case, but the room, the respect, the power he clung to so tightly. Kevin Brooks, the CEO, would be there too, watching. Nathan's uncle or not, Kevin didn't suffer fools. If I played this right, it wouldn't just be a win, it'd be a coup. But as I worked, a shadow crept into the edges of my mind. Emily's collapse replayed in slow motion, her shallow breaths, the thud of her head against the desk. She'd trusted me, leaned on me, and I'd promised to fight for her. This wasn't just about Nathan anymore, it was about her, about every soul he'd crushed under his heel. The weight of that promise settled into my bones, heavy and unyielding. I wanted revenge, yes, but I wanted something more, to pull her out of the wreckage, to prove this place didn't have to break people to build power. The office lights buzzed overhead, a faint drone that matched the hum in my chest. I stood, stretching the stiffness from my shoulders, and walked to the window. Atlanta glittered below, its pulse steady and relentless. Up here, in the quiet, I could feel the tide turning. Tomorrow, Nathan would walk into that meeting thinking he held all the cards. He had no idea I'd already reshuffled the deck. The conference room waited down the hall, its frosted doors glinting in the low light. I pictured it as it'd be in a few hours, Lefebvre at the head of the table, his sharp eyes dissecting every word, Kevin leaning back, arms crossed, waiting for someone to blink, Nathan in his tailored suit, all swagger and no substance. And me, standing in the wings, ready to strike. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, eyes hard, jaw set. I barely recognized myself, not the kid who'd left a decade ago, not the man who'd stepped off that elevator last week. Someone new, forged in the heat of this fight. A noise snapped me out of it, a faint clatter from the elevator bay. I turned, half expecting Nathan to swagger back in, but it was just the night janitor, his cart rattling across the tile. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding and glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. The meeting was in 9 hours, and I still had work to do. But as I sat back down, the Duval file opened before me, I felt a clarity I hadn't in years. This was it, the turning point. Not just for me, but for Emily, for the whole damn game. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp in the silence, and dove back in. The words flowed now, French phrases weaving through English notes, a blueprint for the ambush I'd spring. Nathan wouldn't see it coming, and that was the beauty of it. He'd built his empire on sand, and I was about to kick it over. But even as the plan solidified, a question gnawed at me, quiet but persistent. When the dust settled, who would I be? The hero Emily needed, or just another player in the gray? The city pulsed on outside, oblivious to the war brewing in these walls. I leaned into the work, the fire burning steady now, and let the answer wait. Tomorrow would tell me who I'd become. The morning sun sliced through the blinds of Carter and Hayes, casting thin, jagged lines across the conference room table. I stood at the window, coffee in hand, the steam curling up like a ghost of last night's resolve. The city below was waking up, its hum a distant roar, but up here, the silence was suffocating. My eyes felt gritty, my shoulders stiff from hours hunched over the Duval file, but the fire in my gut burned steady. Today was the day, Nathan's throne would wobble, and I'd be the one to push it. The room smelled of polished wood and anticipation, the kind that hangs thick before a storm. The long table stretched out behind me, empty now, but in an hour it'd be a battlefield. Lefebvre would sit at the head, his sharp Parisian accent cutting through the air. Kevin Brooks would take the far end, his presence a quiet thunder, and Nathan would strut in like he owned it all, oblivious to the trap I'd set. My fingers tightened around the mug, the heat seeping into my palms. I could still hear his laugh from last night, that cold, hollow sound as Emily crumpled. It echoed in my skull, fueling the heat that had kept me up all night. The elevator dinged down the hall, a sharp note that snapped me out of my haze. Footsteps followed, quick, uneven, and I turned just as Emily stepped through the frosted glass doors. She looked fragile still, her face pale against the dark sweater she'd thrown on, but her eyes were clearer, steadier than they'd been when the paramedics took her. Relief hit me like a wave, softening the edges of my anger for a moment. She was back. She was okay. "James," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I didn't expect you here so early." I set the mug down, forcing a half smile. "Couldn't sleep. Too much riding on today." "You sure you're up for this? You should be resting." She hesitated, then crossed the room, her steps deliberate. "I'm fine. The hospital gave me fluids, some lecture about stress. I couldn't stay away, not today." She stopped a few feet from me, her hands twisting together. "I heard what happened after I went down. You stayed. You worked the Duval file all night." Her words hung there, heavy with something I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or surprise. I shrugged, brushing it off. Someone had to. Nathan wasn't going to. She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "No, he wouldn't. But you did. For me. I don't know how to thank you." "Don't," I said, sharper than I meant to. "This isn't about thanks. It's about what's right. He doesn't get to grind you down and walk away laughing." Her eyes met mine, searching, and for a second, I saw the spark I'd glimpsed that first day, buried under the exhaustion, but alive. "You really hate him, don't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned back to the window, the city sprawling out like a chessboard. Hate. It was a strong word, one I hadn't let myself pin down until now. "It's not just hate," I said finally, my breath fogging the glass. "It's bigger than that. He's not just an ass, he's a parasite. Feeds off people like you, like I used to be. I came back here to take something for myself, but now I want to see him fall." The confession slipped out, raw and unpolished, and I felt the weight of it settle between us. I hadn't planned to say it, hadn't even fully admitted it to myself until that moment. But it was true. The hunger I'd carried from Paris wasn't just ambition anymore, it was vengeance, sharp and personal. And Emily was part of it now, whether I'd meant her to be or not. She didn't respond right away, and the silence stretched thin. Then she stepped closer, her voice low. "I get it. More than you think. Nathan's been my shadow for 2 years, every mistake I make, he's there to twist it, every win I scrape together, he claims. I thought it was just me, that I wasn't good enough. But last night, seeing you stand up to him, it changed something." I glanced at her, caught off guard by the steel in her tone. "Changed what?" "Me," she said simply. "I'm done being afraid of him. I want in, whatever you're planning today, I want to help." Her words hit me like a jolt, stirring the fire into a roar. I'd been ready to carry this alone, to shield her from the fallout, but here she was, stepping into the ring. I nodded, slow and deliberate. "All right. But it's not pretty. We're taking him down in front of everyone, Lefebvre, Kevin, the whole damn team. You ready for that?" Her jaw tightened, and she gave a single, firm nod. "I am. What's the plan?" Before I could answer, the door swung open again, and Nathan strode in, his suit crisp, his smirk already in place. He stopped short when he saw us, his eyes narrowing as they flicked between me and Emily. "Well, look at this," he drawled, tossing his briefcase onto the table with a thud. "The damsel's back from distress, and Carter's still playing knight. Didn't think you'd show, Harper. Figured you'd cracked for good." Emily stiffened beside me, but she didn't flinch. "I'm here," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm ready." Nathan's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, and I felt a surge of pride. She wasn't crumbling this time. He recovered fast, though, leaning back against the table, arms crossed. "Cute. Let's see how long that lasts. Lefebvre's a shark, you'll be chum by lunch." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, my voice low and cold. "Funny, Nathan. I'd say you're the one who's out of his depth. How's your French these days? Still stumbling over bonjour?" His eyes flashed, a crack in the mask, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. "Watch it, Carter," he growled. "You're not running this show. I am." "We'll see," I said, holding his gaze until he looked away first. The air crackled, thick with the promise of what was coming. He didn't know it yet, but I'd spent the night turning his game board upside down. And Emily, she wasn't just a pawn anymore. She was my ace. The room started to fill then, associates trickling in, their murmurs a low buzz. Kevin Brooks arrived last, his broad frame filling the doorway, his eyes sweeping the scene like a judge stepping into court. He nodded at me, a faint flicker of recognition, and I remembered what I'd heard. Decades ago, he'd known my father, back when Carter and Hayes was just a name on a letterhead. That tie, thin as it was, might just tip the scales today. Lefebvre entered next, his silver hair gleaming under the lights, his handshake firm as he greeted us in rapid French. Nathan jumped in, his accent butchered but loud, and I let him. Let him dig his hole. I caught Emily's eye across the table, a silent signal, and she nodded back, her hand steady as she opened her notes. The meeting kicked off, and Nathan took the lead, his voice booming with false confidence. I sat back, waiting, the tension coiling tighter with every misstep he made. Lefebvre's brow furrowed, his questions sharpening, and Nathan started to sweat. Then it happened, Emily collapsed, right there at the table, her chair scraping as she slumped forward. Gasps rippled through the room, and Nathan froze, his mouth half open. I was on my feet in an instant, kneeling beside her, my heart hammering. Emily, stay with me. Her eyes fluttered, dazed, and I felt a stab of fear, then relief as she gripped my arm, weak but awake. The paramedics were called again, but this time, the room didn't empty. All eyes were on us, on Nathan, who stood there, useless, and on me, who'd moved when it mattered. Kevin's voice cut through the chaos, deep and calm. James, take care of her. Nathan, sit down. It wasn't a request. As I helped Emily to a chair, Kevin turned to Lefebvre, switching to flawless French I didn't know he had. Astérisque monsieur, pardonnez ce désordre. James va reprendre asterisk, Lefebvre nodded, his gaze shifting to me, expectant. I stood, adrenaline surging, and launched into the Duval pitch, every detail I'd memorized, every nuance Emily had prepped, delivered in perfect Parisian French. The room went still, Nathan's face paling as I owned it, step by step. When I finished, Lefebvre clapped, a rare smile breaking his stern mask. Asterisk magnifique, asterisk, he said. You've got my business. Kevin's eyes met mine, a glint of approval there, and he turned to Nathan. You're off Duval. James, it's yours. Department head's yours too, effective now. The words landed like a gavel, and Nathan's jaw dropped, his empire crumbling in real time. I felt the rush of victory, but it was tempered by Emily's shaky breath beside me, her hand still on my arm. She looked up, gratitude and something fiercer in her eyes, and I knew, this wasn't just my win. It was ours. The room buzzed as people filed out, but I lingered, watching Nathan slump in his chair, defeated. The power had shifted, and I'd claimed it. But as Emily squeezed my arm, a quiet "thank you" on her lips, I wondered what it had cost, and what I'd become in the fight. The air in the hospital corridor was sterile and sharp, a cold bite of antiseptic that stung my nose as I paced outside Emily's room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the linoleum floor, its scuffed surface reflecting the weight of too many restless steps. My shoes clicked against it, a steady rhythm that couldn't drown out the storm raging in my head. Victory should have tasted sweeter, Nathan's demotion, the department head title now mine, Lefebvre's handshake still warm in my memory, but it didn't. Not with Emily lying in that bed, her collapse replaying in my mind like a film stuck on a single, brutal frame. I stopped at the window, peering through the blinds into her room. She was propped up against pillows, and 4 lines snaking from her arm, her face pale but her eyes open, tracking the nurse who adjusted the drip. Relief hit me first, a quiet wave that softened the edges of my tension. She was awake. She was fighting. But beneath that came the anger, hot and jagged, clawing up my throat. Nathan had done this, pushed her to the brink, then stood there gawking as she fell. And I'd let it happen again, too caught up in my own war to see how close she'd been to breaking. The door creaked behind me, and I turned as the nurse stepped out, her clipboard tucked under one arm. She's stable, she said, her voice clipped but kind. Exhaustion, mostly, stress piled on top of no sleep. She's asking for you. I nodded, my throat tight, and slipped past her into the room. The space was small, suffocatingly so, with beige walls that seemed to close in around the bed. A single chair sat in the corner, its vinyl cracked and peeling, and the faint beep of a monitor punctuated the silence. Emily looked up as I entered, her lips curving into a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. James, she said, her voice hoarse. You didn't have to come. Like hell I didn't, I shot back, pulling the chair closer and dropping into it. Up close, the strain on her was stark, her skin almost translucent, shadows carving deep hollows under her cheekbones. You scared the shit out of me back there. Twice in 2 days? You're making this a habit. She let out a shaky laugh, then winced, pressing a hand to her side. Guess I'm not as tough as I thought. Sorry you had to see that. Don't apologize, I said, leaning forward, my elbows on my knees. None of this is on you. It's him, Nathan. He's the one who should be sorry, and I'm going to make damn sure he is. Her smile faded, and she studied me, her gaze sharper now despite the fatigue. You already did. I heard what happened after I went down. You took the meeting, the case, everything. Kevin gave you his spot. That's huge. I shrugged, the weight of it settling heavier on my shoulders than I'd expected. It's not enough. Not yet. He's still here, still breathing down our necks. I want him gone, Emily. Out of this firm, out of our lives. The words hung between us, raw and unfiltered, and I saw something flicker in her eyes, surprise, maybe, or recognition. She shifted against the pillows, her fingers twisting the edge of the thin blanket. You sound like you're planning something. What's next? I exhaled, running a hand through my hair, the strands damp with sweat from the day's chaos. I don't know yet. But I've got leverage now, Lefebvre's deal, Kevin's trust. Nathan's on the ropes, and he knows it. He'll come at me harder, though. He's not the type to slink off quietly. She nodded, slow and deliberate, her jaw tightening. He won't. He'll fight dirty, he always does. I've seen it. Last year, when I caught him fudging a billing report, he turned it around on me, said I'd messed up the numbers. I almost lost my job over it. The confession hit me like a punch, stoking the fire that had been simmering since the meeting. He what? My voice came out low, a growl I barely recognized. Why didn't you say anything? Her shoulders slumped, and she looked away, her gaze fixing on the 4-line. Because I was scared. He's got power, James, family ties, years of dirt on people. I was just an associate, barely hanging on. What was I supposed to do? I leaned back, the chair creaking under me, and let the silence stretch. She was right, Nathan wasn't just a bully, he was a machine, built to grind down anyone who crossed him. I'd felt it a decade ago, and I'd seen it in her now. But I wasn't that kid anymore, and she didn't have to be alone in this. You're not just an associate now, I said finally, meeting her eyes. You've got me. And I've got enough on him to bury him, if we play it right. Her head snapped up, a spark flaring in her expression. You mean, evidence? Maybe, I said, my mind racing. The billing thing, that's a start. If he's done it once, he's done it before. And after today, Kevin's watching him closer than ever. One slip, one crack, and we've got him. She swallowed, her hands stilling on the blanket. I could help. I kept records, emails, notes. I didn't know what to do with them then, but if you think they'd work, they will, I cut in, the plan snapping into focus. But not yet. We need to be smart, wait for him to trip, then hit him where it hurts. You focus on getting better. I'll handle the rest. Her lips parted, a protest forming, but I held up a hand. I mean it, Emily. You're no good to me, or yourself, if you push too hard and end up back here. Rest. That's an order. She smirked, a faint echo of the fire I'd seen in her before. You're not my boss yet, Carter. Give it a day, I shot back, grinning despite the weight pressing down on me. Department head's got a nice ring to it. The moment of levity faded fast, though, as footsteps echoed in the hall, sharp, deliberate, the kind that carried intent. I tensed, my gut telling me who it was before I even turned. The door swung open, and there he was, Nathan, his suit rumpled now, his tie loosened like he'd been tugging at it in frustration. His eyes locked on me first, dark and venomous, then flicked to Emily, a sneer curling his lip. Well, isn't this touching, he said, his voice dripping with acid. The hero and the damsel, plotting in the sick ward. What's the play, Carter? Think you can ride this little stunt all the way to the top? I stood, slow and deliberate, planting myself between him and the bed. Stunt? You mean the part where you stood there like a statue while she collapsed? Or the part where I closed a deal you couldn't even pronounce? His jaw twitched, a vein pulsing at his temple, and I felt the air thicken, charged with the clash that had been brewing since I walked back into this firm. You think you're clever, he hissed, stepping closer, his breath hot with coffee and rage. Kevin might have bought your act today, but I've got years here, years of sweat, years of wins. You're a blip. A has-been who got lucky. Lucky? I laughed, sharp and cold. I didn't need luck to outshine you, Nathan. Just skill. And a spine. You're the one clinging to family strings, screwing over anyone who gets in your way. How's that working out now? He lunged forward, his chest bumping mine, and I felt my fists clench, the fire roaring to life. But Emily's voice cut through, small but steady. Stop it. Both of you. We froze, Nathan's glare still boring into me, but I stepped back, my hands unclenching as I glanced at her. She was sitting up straighter now, her eyes fierce despite the pallor. Nathan, get out, she said, her voice trembling but firm. You don't own me anymore. And James, he's not the has-been here. The silence that followed was deafening. The monitors beeped the only sound as Nathan's face twisted, fury warring with something else, fear, maybe. He opened his mouth, then shut it, his sneer faltering. Without another word, he turned and stormed out, the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the frame. I exhaled, the adrenaline draining fast, leaving me hollow. Emily sank back against the pillows, her breath shaky but her gaze locked on me. "You okay?" I asked, sinking back into the chair. "Yeah," she said, swallowing hard. I think I am. For the first time in a while." I nodded, the weight of her words settling over me. She was in this now, fully, her fear giving way to something stronger. And me? I'd won today, but Nathan's exit wasn't the end. He'd come back swinging, and the pressure was only climbing. The hospital room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the reality hit. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a war, and I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't unmake. Outside, the city lights blinked on, a sea of stars against the dusk. I leaned back, the chair creaking under me, and felt the fire shift, anger hardening into resolve. Nathan wasn't done, but neither was I. And with Emily beside me, battered but unbroken, I knew we'd face whatever came next. Together. The dusk had deepened outside the hospital window, the city lights now a jagged constellation against the blackening sky. Inside, the air was still thick with the echo of Nathan's slamming door, his retreating footsteps a fading drumbeat in the sterile corridor. I sat there, slumped in the cracked vinyl chair beside Emily's bed, my hands resting heavy on my knees. The adrenaline from our clash had ebbed, leaving behind a raw, restless energy that buzzed under my skin. Emily's steady breathing beside me was the only tether keeping me from pacing the room again. She drifted off, exhaustion finally claiming her, and I envied that peace even as I guarded it. The hospital room felt like a pressure cooker, its beige walls shrinking with every tick of the clock. I could still feel Nathan's chest against mine, the heat of his breath, the venom in his glare. He'd lost today, lost the Duval case, lost his title, but I knew him too well to think he'd slink away. He was a cornered animal now, and those were the most dangerous kind. My fingers drummed against my thigh, a staccato rhythm of unease. I'd climbed higher than I'd ever dreamed in these past few hours, department head, Kevin's nod of approval, but the higher you climb, the harder the fall. And I wasn't fool enough to think this was over. A soft rap at the door jolted me upright. I turned, half expecting Nathan's sneering face again, but it was Kevin Brooks who stepped in, his broad frame filling the doorway like a storm cloud rolling over the horizon. His suit was impeccable despite the late hour, charcoal gray with a tie knotted tight, but his eyes carried the weight of a man who'd seen too many battles. He glanced at Emily, still asleep, then at me, his expression unreadable. "James," he said, his voice low, a gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the linoleum. "Got a minute?" I nodded, rising slowly, my joints protesting from too long in that damn chair. "Yeah. She's out cold, won't hear us." He gestured toward the hall, and I followed, the door clicking shut behind us with a sound that felt final. The corridor was quieter now, the nurse's station a distant hum, and Kevin leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on me like he was peeling back layers. I stood opposite him, hands shoved in my pockets, trying to read the silence. I'd faced him in boardrooms before, but this was different, personal, unguarded, and it set my nerves on edge. "You did good today," he said finally, his tone even but carrying an undercurrent I couldn't place. "Lefebvre's still talking about your pitch. Said it reminded him of Paris in the old days, sharp, no bullshit. That's rare." The praise landed like a stone in my gut, heavy and unexpected. I'd spent the night chasing that win, but hearing it from Kevin, CEO, legend, the man who'd built this firm from nothing, made it real in a way I hadn't anticipated. "Thanks," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Just doing what needed to be done." He tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. "Don't play humble with me, Carter. You didn't just close a deal, you gutted Nathan in front of the whole damn room. Took balls. And brains." I exhaled through my nose, the memory of Nathan's slack jaw flashing behind my eyes. He had it coming. Been a long time since anyone called his bluff. Kevin's smirk faded, and his eyes narrowed, pinning me in place. "Yeah, he did. Too long, maybe. But here's the thing, Nathan's my nephew. Blood. That complicates shit." The words hit like a punch, and I felt my stomach twist. I'd known there was a connection, whispers about family ties had floated around the firm for years, but hearing it straight from Kevin, blunt and unvarnished, made the stakes sharper. "Didn't know it was that close," I admitted, my voice tighter than I wanted. "Changes anything?" "Not for me," he said, pushing off the wall, his hands dropping to his sides. "Family or not, he's been coasting too long, writing my name, screwing over people like Emily. I don't tolerate dead weight, even if it's got my DNA. But he's not going to take this lying down. You ready for that? I met his gaze, the fire flickering back to life in my chest. I've been ready since I walked back in here. He's a bully with a corner office, nothing I haven't handled before. Kevin studied me for a long moment, then nodded, a slow, deliberate motion that felt like a seal on something unspoken. Good. Because I've seen your kind before, James. Hungry. Sharp. Reminds me of your old man, back when we started this place. My breath caught, the mention of my father slicing through the tension like a blade. You knew him? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. I'd heard the stories, Dad as a junior partner, scrappy and relentless, but Kevin had never brought it up, not once in all the years I'd been here. Damn right I did, he said, his voice softening, a rare crack in his armor. Tom Carter was a pit bull, never backed down, even when the odds were stacked. We built this firm on nights like the one you just pulled. He'd be proud as hell, seeing you today. The words sank in, heavy and warm, stirring something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Pride, maybe, or closure, I couldn't tell. Dad had died when I was still clawing my way up, and I'd carried that loss like a shadow, pushing me to prove I could fill his shoes. Hearing Kevin tie us together like that, it lit a spark I didn't know I'd been missing. But before I could respond, he straightened, his tone shifting back to steel. That's why I'm putting you in Nathan's chair, he said. Department head's yours, effective now. But it's not a gift, it's a gauntlet. He's out of Duval, out of the driver's seat, but he's still here. Watching. You've got the reins, James, but you'd better hold tight. I nodded, the weight of it settling over me like a mantle. I will. He's not getting back up, not if I can help it. Kevin clapped a hand on my shoulder, firm and brief, then turned toward the elevator. Get some rest. Tomorrow's a new fight. The door slid open with a ding, and he was gone, leaving me alone in the corridor, the antiseptic sting sharper now against the rush in my veins. I leaned against the wall, my head tipping back, and let it sink in. Department head. My father's legacy tied to mine. Nathan's empire cracked wide open. It was everything I'd wanted when I stepped off that elevator a week ago: power, proof, a place at the table. But as the high coursed through me, a shadow crept in, cold and nagging. Emily's collapse. Nathan's glare. The war wasn't won, it was just beginning, and I'd painted a bigger target on my back than ever. The hospital hummed around me, a low drone of machines and distant voices, but my mind was already racing ahead. Back to Carter and Hayes, to the office that'd be mine tomorrow, Nathan's old throne, its leather chair still warm from his reign. I pictured it, the mahogany desk gleaming under the fluorescent lights, the city sprawling out beyond the glass like a prize I'd finally claimed. But I could feel his presence there too, lurking in the corners, waiting to strike back. A noise from the room snapped me out of it, Emily stirring, her voice a faint murmur. I pushed off the wall and slipped back inside, the door creaking as I eased it shut. She was awake now, her eyes bleary but fixed on me, a question in them she didn't need to ask. Kevin was here, I said, dropping back into the chair beside her. I'm in. Department head. Nathan's out. Her lips parted, a breath escaping as she processed it. You did it, she whispered, a faint smile breaking through the fatigue. You really did it. We did it, I corrected, leaning forward, my hands clasping together. You held up your end, those notes, that prep. I just swung the bat. She shook her head, the smile fading into something softer, more fragile. No, James. You saved me today. Not just the deal, me. I was drowning, and you pulled me out. The gratitude in her voice hit me harder than Kevin's praise, lodging somewhere deep in my chest. I wanted to brush it off, to keep the armor up, but her eyes held mine, steady and unguarded, and I felt the crack widen. You're tougher than you think, I said finally, my voice rough. You're still here. That's what matters. She nodded, her fingers tightening on the blanket, and for a moment, we just sat there, the silence thick with everything we didn't say. Relief, yes, her recovery, my triumph, but beneath it, a shared resolve. Nathan wasn't gone, not yet. And this victory? It was a spark, not the fire's end. The next morning came too fast, the city outside my apartment window still cloaked in gray when I left for the firm. Carter and Hayes loomed ahead as I stepped off the elevator, its glass walls catching the first streaks of dawn. The floor was quiet, desks empty, but the air crackled with the shift I'd set in motion. I crossed to Nathan's office, my office now, the door ajar, the scent of leather and power wafting out. I paused there, taking it in, the desk, the view, the weight of it all. My pulse kicked up, a mix of triumph and dread, and I stepped inside, claiming it with every breath. The chair creaked as I sank into it, the leather cool against my back. I ran my hands over the desk, its surface smooth and unbroken, a kingdom handed to me in the night. But before I could settle, a shadow fell across the doorway. I looked up, and there he was, Nathan, his face a mask of barely contained rage, a mug of tea steaming in his hands. "Morning, boss," he said, the words dripping with mockery as he set the mug down hard enough to slosh liquid onto the wood. "Thought you might need this. Long day ahead, right?" I leaned back, meeting his glare with a calm I didn't fully feel. "Thanks, Nathan. Appreciate the gesture. How's it feel, bringing me tea instead of barking orders?" His jaw twitched, his hands flexing at his sides, and I saw the storm brewing behind his eyes. "Don't get comfortable," he hissed, leaning in close. "You think this is over? I've got years here, years you can't touch. Enjoy the chair while it lasts." He straightened, turning to go, but I called after him, my voice low and sharp. "Nathan." He froze, half turning, and I held his gaze, letting the fire show. "It's not just the chair. It's the game. And you're losing." He didn't answer, just stormed out, his footsteps echoing down the hall. I picked up the tea, its heat seeping into my palms, and took a slow sip, the bitterness sharp on my tongue. The office stretched around me, a throne room bathed in morning light, but the tension coiled tighter than ever. Nathan was down, not out, and Emily's fight, our fight, was far from finished. The morning light spilled across my new office, painting the mahogany desk in warm streaks that softened its hard edges. I stood by the window, the tea Nathan had left still bitter on my tongue, its steam curling up in lazy tendrils that fogged the glass. Atlanta sprawled below, a restless giant stirring awake, its skyline a jagged testament to ambition and grit. The chair behind me, my chair now, creaked faintly as I shifted my weight, its leather still carrying the faint imprint of Nathan's reign. I'd claimed it, yes, but the victory felt fragile, like a breath held too long. The air in here was thick, not just with the scent of power, but with the weight of what came next. I set the mug down, the clink against the wood sharper than it should have been, and my eyes drifted to the stack of files on the desk. Duval was done, Lefebvre's signature locked in, but a new project loomed, a European ad campaign, sprawling and complex, the kind of beast that could either cement my place here or unravel everything I'd fought for. My pulse ticked up, a familiar heat stirring in my chest. This wasn't just a job anymore, it was a proving ground, and I wasn't stepping into it alone. The door swung open behind me, a soft scrape against the carpet, and I turned to see Emily framed in the threshold. She looked different today, still pale, still fragile around the edges, but there was a steadiness in her step, a quiet fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Her dark hair was loose, brushing her shoulders, and she carried a laptop under one arm, a thin folder tucked against her chest. The hospital's shadow lingered on her, but she'd shed its weight, or at least learned to carry it differently. "Morning," she said, her voice clear despite the faint rasp left from yesterday. "Hope I'm not interrupting your victory lap." I smirked, leaning back against the desk, arms crossing over my chest. "No lap yet. Just trying to figure out how long it'll take Nathan to poison this tea." Her lips twitched, a spark of amusement breaking through, and she stepped inside, setting her things down on the conference table that stretched along the far wall. He'd probably call it a strategic gift. "You know, keep your enemies close." "Close enough to strangle," I muttered, and she laughed, a real laugh, small but alive, cutting through the tension like a blade. It hit me then, how much I'd needed to hear that sound. Relief washed over me, cool and steady, loosening the knot that had been lodged in my gut since her collapse. She was here, whole, and that alone felt like a win I hadn't earned yet. She caught my stare and tilted her head, a question in her eyes. "What?" "Nothing," I said, shaking it off. "Just glad you're back. You sure you're up for this? European ad project's no joke, tight deadlines, picky clients. I can handle it solo if you need more time." Her jaw tightened, and she straightened, planting her hands on the table. "I'm in, James. No more sidelines. I've spent too long letting Nathan dictate my pace, I'm done with that." The steel in her voice caught me off guard, and I felt a flicker of pride flare alongside the relief. She wasn't just back, she was ready to fight. I nodded, pushing off the desk and crossing to the table. "All right. Let's do it, then. Vad har you got?" She flipped open the folder, spreading out a handful of papers, memos, timelines, a rough pitch she'd scribbled in tight, precise handwriting. "It's an ad rollout for a luxury brand, Paris-based, branching into Germany and Italy. They want edgy but elegant, and they're obsessed with authenticity. I pulled some prelim data last night after I got home. Thought we could lean into the European angle, your French, my research." I scanned the pages, the details snapping into focus. Her work was sharp, meticulous, the kind of foundation that could turn a gamble into a sure thing. "This is good," I said, tapping a finger on the timeline. "Real good. We pitch this right, it's not just a win, it's a statement. Shows the firm we're not slowing down." Her eyes lit up, a quiet thrill breaking through her fatigue. "That's what I was thinking. Nathan's still lurking, he'll be watching for us to stumble. This could bury him deeper. The mention of his name sent a jolt through me, the fire flaring hot again. I glanced toward the door, half expecting his shadow to darken it, but the hall beyond was empty, the floor still quiet in the early hour. He's not just watching, I said, my voice dropping low. He's plotting. That T-stunt? It's a taunt. He's not done swinging. Emily nodded, her fingers tightening on the edge of the folder. I know. That's why I brought this. She slid a single sheet from the bottom of the stack, a printed email, time-stamped from last year, the subject line stark, billing adjustment, Duval. My eyes skimmed it, and my gut clenched. It was Nathan, instructing her to tweak the hours on a client invoice, his tone casual but commanding, like he'd done it 100 times before. Below it, in her own notes, she'd flagged the discrepancy, hours billed that didn't match the work logged. Jesus, I breathed, looking up at her. You kept this? Every word, she said, her voice steady but edged with something raw. After he blamed me for it, I started saving everything, emails, notes, even a voice memo once. I didn't know what to do with it then. But now it's a weapon, I finished, the pieces clicking into place. My mind raced, mapping the moves ahead. If we take this to Kevin, hell, to the board, it's not just a demotion. It's expulsion. Fraud's a death sentence here. She swallowed, her gaze flickering with a mix of resolve and fear. I want him gone, James. Not just for me, for everyone he's stepped on. But, what if it backfires? He's got allies, family. What if they turn it on us? The question hung there, heavy and real, and I felt the old doubt creep in, cold and insistent. She was right, Nathan wasn't defenseless, even now. Kevin might have backed me, but blood ran deep, and the firm's gray edges could shield a man like him if he spun it right. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, the wood cool under my palms. It won't, I said, forcing certainty into my voice. We've got the truth, hard evidence, not just whispers. And Kevin's already on our side. He wants this place clean, I saw it in him last night. We play this smart, Nathan's finished. Her eyes searched mine, and after a beat, she nodded, the fear giving way to something fiercer. Okay. When? Soon, I said, straightening. We prep the ad pitch first, lock in the win, show the team we're solid. Then we drop this on him when he's got no ground left to stand on. He'll never see it coming. She exhaled, a slow release of tension, and flipped open her laptop, the screen glowing to life. Then let's get to work. The next hour blurred into a rhythm of papers and keystrokes, the office filling with the hum of our voices, hers sharp and focused, mine weaving French phrases into the pitch. The conference table became a war room, its surface littered with coffee cups and notes, the city outside fading into a distant pulse. I watched her as we worked, the way her hands moved with purpose, the way she pushed through the exhaustion still clinging to her. She'd changed, grown into the fight, not just beside me but with me, and I felt the shift in myself too. The hunger I'd carried from Paris wasn't just mine anymore, it was ours, a shared fire burning brighter than I'd expected. The door burst open mid-sentence, shattering the quiet. Nathan stormed in, his face a mask of fury, a crumpled memo clenched in his fist. You think you're slick, Carter? He snarled, slamming the paper onto the table. It was an internal announcement, my promotion, official now, emailed to the firm an hour ago. Stealing my chair wasn't enough, you're gunning for my skin too? I stood, slow and deliberate, meeting his glare head on. You lost the chair because you didn't deserve it. And your skin? That's on you, every lie, every shortcut. We've got proof, Nathan. It's over. His eyes flicked to Emily, narrowing as he registered her presence, the laptop, the papers. You, he hissed, jabbing a finger at her. This is you, isn't it? Digging up dirt, playing victim. I made you here, you broke me here, she cut in, rising from her chair, her voice trembling but unyielding. You buried me in work, twisted my mistakes, stole my wins. I've got every email, every order you gave me to lie. You're done, Nathan. We're taking it to Kevin. The room went still, the air crackling with the weight of her words. Nathan's face paled, his fist unclenching, the memo fluttering to the floor. For the first time, I saw it, panic, real and unguarded, stripping away the smirk he'd worn like armor. You wouldn't, he said, but it came out weak, a plea more than a threat. Watch us, I said, stepping closer, my voice low and cold. You've got two choices, walk away now, or we drag you out in pieces. Kevin's waiting. He staggered back, his breath ragged, and I could see the fight draining out of him, replaced by a dawning realization. The throne he'd built was gone, cracked by his own hands, toppled by ours. He opened his mouth, then shut it, his shoulders slumping as he turned for the door. This isn't over, he muttered, but it sounded hollow, a last gasp of defiance as he slipped out, the door clicking shut behind him. Emily sank back into her chair, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her face. God, she whispered. Did we just? Yeah, I said, dropping into the seat beside her, the adrenaline draining fast. We did. The silence stretched, heavy but not oppressive, and I felt the tension unravel, replaced by a quiet satisfaction I hadn't known I'd been chasing. She looked at me, her eyes bright despite the fatigue, and smiled, a real one this time, unguarded and fierce. We're a team now, huh? Damn right, I said, grinning back, the weight of the fight settling into something solid, something good. Let's finish this pitch. Show them who we are? We dove back in, the hours slipping away as the office woke up around us, phones ringing, voices drifting through the glass. By noon, the pitch was done, a sleek, brutal thing that'd turn heads in Paris and beyond. I leaned back, staring at the screen, and felt the fire shift, not gone, but tempered, a steady burn I could live with. Emily was safe, stronger than ever, and Nathan, he'd reform, or he'd fade. Either way, he wasn't our problem anymore. Later, as the sun dipped low, I stood at the window again, the city glowing gold against the dusk. The office hummed behind me, alive with the team we'd started to build, Emily at its heart, her voice carrying as she briefed the others. I thought of my father then, the pitbull Kevin had called him, and felt a pang of something soft, something finished. I'd come back to prove myself, to claim what was mine, but I'd found more, a purpose, a partner, a fight worth winning. The tea was cold now, forgotten on the desk, but I didn't need it. The hunger was still there, quieter now, pointing me forward. Toward Europe, toward whatever came next. I turned from the window, catching Emily's eye across the room, and nodded. She nodded back, and I knew, we were just getting started.